Thank you again for coming to another Climate Matters show, a press conference disguised as a TV talk show about very serious matters, climate matters. My name is Stuart Scott. I'm your host for today's show. We're coming to you live from COP23. The presidency is the nation of Fiji. It's being hosted in Bonn, Germany. Here's my email address. I like to give it at the beginning and end of my shows so that people can write with comments, questions for guests, etc. So today's guest is Dr. Philip Lawn. Philip is associated with many institutes that are involved with sustainability in Australia. The Centre for Full Employment and Equity, the Binzager Institute for Sustainable Prosperity, Wakefield Futures Group, and the International Society for Ecological Economics. And today's show, Herman Daly's 10 Candles, Economic Policies to Fix Climate Change. Also subtitled as 10 Ways to Avert Ecological Disaster, because as we know in this room, we are courting ecological disaster. And climate change is just the leading edge of that ecological disaster. Now, this is Herman Daly. He's not a well-known figure internationally, but he has been for decades trying to make the world realize that the current economic system we have, which is actually known as Neoclassical growth economics, is flawed. It's defective. It's leading us to our own demise, in fact. He was a former World Bank senior economist in charge of their environmentally sustainable investing. He resigned in 1994 saying that they just didn't get it. None of their investing was sustainable at that time. Now, they've changed some since then. He's also known as the father of ecological economics. And we'll be talking today essentially about ecological economics. Here's one quote from Dr. Daly. "There is something fundamentally wrong with treating the earth as if it were a business in liquidation." And that's what we're doing. We are cashing in the natural resources and filling the waste sinks, like the atmospheric carbon sink, as quickly as possible for the sake of making money. Now, I'm going to give the mic to my guest, Philip. Please, would you go through the problems with growth economics?
Thank you very much, Stuart. So, what are the problems with growth economics, neoclassical growth economics? Well, to start with, largely because of the influence of neoclassical growth economics, growth of the economy is basically civilization's primary goal, regardless of which country you're referring to. Despite technological progress, growth requires more resources, the use of more resources. Growth generates more waste, including greenhouse gases. And as a consequence, current growth of the global economy is ecologically unsustainable. It's already unsustainable. In order just to maintain the rate of resource use, the rate at which we generate waste and fill up our waste sinks on a sustainable basis forever, we would require 1.7 Earths. We've only got one Earth. So, growth economics is inconsistent with sustainable development. And that's important because embodied within the Paris Agreement is the concept of sustainable development. And so growth economics is not only inconsistent with sustainable development, it's inconsistent with achieving our climate change goals.
If I may insert one thing here, if you look at the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals at number 8, you'll find that economic growth is built into that, with a minimum target of 7% growth in developing nations and nothing specified about developed nations who are not going to give up growth either. The current meme, humanity's meme, is that we all have to grow, and we can't see that that growth is killing us.
Okay, so what's the alternative? Well, according to Herman Daly, who's been pushing this concept of a steady state economy for about 45, close to 50 years, the steady state economy is an alternative to the growth economy. The steady state economy is a non-growing economy in terms of its material throughput, in terms of the amount of resources that enter the economy to produce goods and services, and in terms of the waste that is generated when goods and services are consumed, including greenhouse gas emissions. The thing about the steady state economy is it places an emphasis on quality, not quantity, doing better rather than doing more. And as a consequence, it focuses on improving human well-being without continued growth in resource use. A lot of people would ask the question, if you don't increase resource use, how are we going to be better off? The concept of a steady state economy as an alternative to the growth economy is to improve well-being without the need for the growth in resource use.
In other words, make our cell phones last more than 2 years.
Which you can do if you improve the quality of what you do rather than the quantity. If you do as much, and in the case of wealthy countries, we'll probably have to do less. It doesn't lower your well-being if the quality of what you do increases. And of course, the notion of a steady state economy, that the economy grows to a certain point, then it remains at a particular physical scale, is critical to achieving ecological sustainability. If we're going to ensure that the rate at which we use resources and generate waste, including the generation of greenhouse gas emissions, is ecologically sustainable, then we have to stop growing the economy at some point. Now, what does this mean? It means wealthy countries have to stop now. There's some need for low to middle income countries that need further growth that's as efficient and as equitable as possible. But that underlines just how important it is right now for wealthy countries to start moving towards a steady state economy. In fact, I've written a number of times about this, and I've argued that we need to start moving the wealthy countries, should I say, towards a steady state economy immediately. Not in 20, 30, 40 years' time, but now.
He is an authority on climate change in terms of the economic causes and has written at least one book. How many books have you written?
Oh, that's the only one on climate change.
That's on climate change.
But that's as consistent with Herman Daly's Ecological Economics. And of course, the thing about the steady state economy is, unlike the growth economy, it's consistent with sustainable development. It's consistent with sustainable development because it's sustainable, meets the sustainability requirement, and it ensures development because you're improving what you're doing rather than doing more. Development, is a qualitative term. If you improve what you're doing, you can develop as a nation without having to grow the economy.
Before we go on, because the reason you probably have not heard of ecological economics is that it's been suppressed by the mainstream neoclassical growth economists for all the time it's been in existence, because it undercuts the fundamental assumption that we can and should grow the scale of our economy forever. If you confront any business school economics professor with the notion that there are limits to growth, they will wave hands, balk, say human ingenuity is limitless. Not so. Resources are limited. So let's move on to Herman Daly's 10 candles. Now, we don't have enough time today to cover all of them in any depth, and we'll have to skip over some of them, which are a bit complex except for economists, but here you go.
Basically, these 10 candles are the means by which we can make the transition from a growth economy to a steady state economy. And the first of Daly's 10 candles is the concept of cap auction trade systems for resources and sinks. And the whole notion of the idea of cap auction trade systems is to ensure sustainability or greenhouse gas targets, in the case of climate change, are achieved in the most efficient way. It does this because the cap sets the limit either on the rate of resource use or the rate of greenhouse gas emissions. The rights to emissions are distributed amongst countries based on need and historical emissions. Then each national government auctions those rights amongst the citizens of its people. By doing so, that puts a price on carbon. So it's the price on carbon that promotes the efficient use of resources, ensures that the intensity, the greenhouse gas intensity of economic activity within each country is reduced. So you achieve your cap or emissions targets, and you achieve it in the most efficient way. The second is the concept of ecological tax reform. Governments need to tax us. We can't get away from that. Given that, governments need to think creatively about the way they can tax us, how they should tax us. What governments ought to be doing is discouraging bads or bad things. What are bads and bad things? Resource depletion and pollution, including the generation of greenhouse gas emissions. How do you, as a government, discourage greenhouse gas emissions, resource depletion, waste generation through the tax system? You tax.
One of my favorite quotes from Herman Daly is, tax the bads, not the goods.
Right.
Currently, we're taxing value added. We should be taxing resource depletion.
So, part of the ecological tax reform is to tax bads and reduce the existing taxes on good things, desirable things. You want to encourage desirable things, discourage undesirable things. Most countries have a distorted tax system that in fact encourages bads and discourages goods. The ecological tax reform is also important because if you do start taxing bads, such as greenhouse gas emissions, there's the potential for goods and services, electricity generation that involves the emission of greenhouse gases to rise. That's going to be difficult for poor people to meet the increase in costs. So the tax system can be designed in such a way as to compensate poor people so they're not unduly affected by the increase in the price of goods and services as a result of a carbon tax. I'm going to just skip number 3. I think
this one is very topical and we have very little time.
It's very, very important. We're talking here about limiting the range of inequality in income distribution, not only within countries but between countries. And that's quite critical in terms of climate change and the reason why there's a need for climate change finance to help the low and middle income countries meet their greenhouse gas. Okay, I'm not going to talk about number 4. It's relevant, but it's not that relevant to climate change. I am going to talk about number 5, re-regulating international commerce. One of the things that discourages governments from placing or imposing a carbon tax is the concern that if you impose a carbon tax that increases the cost of producing goods and services within your country, and therefore you become, from an international trading perspective, uncompetitive. The notion of re-regulating international commerce is this idea that countries that are willing to put a price on carbon should be given the opportunity to place compensating tariffs on those goods produced by countries that do not impose a tax or a price on carbon. Why should a country be penalised for putting a price on carbon? Now, a lot of people will say there's the potential for a tariff war and so forth, and I won't be talking about the World Trade Organisation, but the World Trade Organisation ought to, and is not, but ought to be the ideal organisation to review and sanction so-called green tariffs to prevent trade wars and to ensure that the international allocation of resources is as efficient as possible. Okay, so I'm going to skip point 6.
I wanted to say a word about this because this is my favorite of the 10 candles. I don't know if you've heard of fractional reserve banking, but banks around the world have a license to create money out of thin air. They put $1 million, say, on deposit with the central bank of the nation, and they can lend out $9 million. That $9 million, what does it do? It goes to work harvesting nature, building buildings which require resources, projects of all kinds. Dr. Daly points out that if we change that reserve requirement gradually so that instead of putting aside 10% as a reserve against people wanting their money back, the depositors, they had to put away 20 and then 30 and then 40 until finally they were required to only lend out the money that had been deposited with them, then our economic mega growth, our accelerating growth, would gradually taper off. And we would find ourselves in a much better planet as a result. The rich would not get richer quite as quickly, but the rest of us would probably benefit greatly.
Again, I'm going to skip 8 and move on to 9. It's a controversial topic, but
This is the elephant in the room. This is the one that's very difficult to talk about. It's politically not correct to talk about. We must talk about it.
But population stabilisation is critical to resolving the climate change crisis. And to put it into perspective, if the per capita, on a global level, if per capita greenhouse gas emissions were to be as they are today in the future, and the global population was to be half what it is today, you would have half as many greenhouse gas emissions. So it's not correct to say that population is not an issue. It is an issue. I'm not going to talk about how population can be stabilised. I believe that there are many ways in which it can. Some are not particularly palatable, others are, and of course that's an important area of discussion. Unfortunately, it tends to be avoided because of the controversy of population growth, but it needs to be spoken about and discussed. And finally, reform of national accounts. You might ask the question, what's that got to do with resolving the climate change crisis? Well, the most fundamental economic indicator of so-called progress is a thing called gross domestic product. Politicians and mainstream economists talk about gross domestic product, which is a measure of the volume of economic activity. And we're told that if the volume of economic activity rises, we're better off. The problem with that is that gross domestic product counts everything as a benefit. It doesn't matter if the increase in the volume of economic activity is beneficial, it's costly, it's defensive, it's rehabilitative, it involves the poor getting poorer, the rich getting richer, more people becoming unemployed. We're just told that if the GDP goes up, we're better off.
Let me insert that the hurricanes that recently took out the island of Puerto Rico are actually good for the economy of the United States, because all of that infrastructure needs to be replaced now, which is more bank loans, more building, more materials. This is, as we say in Brooklyn, bass backwards.
And of course, whilst this is going on, you could scarcely say that all this additional spending in Puerto Rico has made life of Puerto Ricans better off. At best, it's going to restore the well-being of those people, yet it will be counted as an improvement in the well-being of Puerto Ricans. So there's an alternative, a thing called the Genuine Progress Indicator, which Herman Daly was instrumental in designing this indicator. What the Genuine Progress Indicator attempts to do is separate out from the GDP those activities that are beneficial and those which are costly. You subtract the costs from the benefits and you come up with a number which essentially is the Genuine Progress Indicator. So the Genuine Progress Indicator is in fact good economics. Gross domestic product is not economics at all. It might be a monetary measure, but it is not an economic measure as such. And I think, Stuart, you were talking yesterday about the fact that the person who was instrumental in the development of gross domestic product, it was basically developed in World War II to enable countries to account for production during the Second World War. Okay, it was not designed, and of course you wanted to keep stock of what was being produced and how much. That was important then.
The gentleman who is credited with having designed the measure said it is not being applied appropriately. It was not designed to do what nations are doing with it now.
So if we just have a quick look at the Genuine Progress Indicator versus gross domestic product, the blue line represents gross domestic product for each country, and the red line, the Genuine Progress Indicator. And you can see that there's a tendency for genuine progress to go up with GDP until the GDP reaches a threshold level. Once that threshold level of GDP is exceeded, genuine progress tends to fall. So any concern about moving towards a steady state economy, which might mean a constant GDP, I can put forward the proposition based on the Genuine Progress Indicator that growth in GDP has not made the well-being of people in high-income countries any better off, but it's come at great cost. These countries, all 6 of these, have increased their greenhouse gas emissions.
I'm sorry we're running out of time. Obviously, Philip is quite passionate, but I wanted to leave just a moment to mention what I consider to be the sharpest arrow in my quiver. I've come up with a Nobel Peace Prize proposal for sustainable development. Please go to that URL np4sd.org, Nobel Prize for Sustainable Development. These are the three nominees. The Club of Rome for a report that they sponsored called The Limits to Growth in the early 1970s. Mainstream economists laughed, scoffed, and suppressed it. Herman Daly for his work with ecological economics, and Pope Francis for his specific focus on sustainable development in a document called Laudato Si, which is known well among the climate community, but not known that well the rest of the world. So again, I'm your host, Stuart Scott. Here's my email address if you'd like to get in touch. And we're coming to you live from Bonn, Germany, COP23. Thank you.
Ooh,